Hello, Jigs and Girls. In the past, I have said that I never DNF books, and that's a lie. What is happening is that if I start a book I have in paperback, or I have bought, or if I have taken as an arc, I'll make sure I'll finish it. However, when it comes to free ebooks from Amazon, yeah, I DNF stuff. And since I have amassed quite a few free Amazon books and started reading quite a few of them and having DNF'd a lot too, I would like to talk to you about why I have DNF'd some indie books, and this may be helpful to other indie writers out there. But before I talk about books on Kindle I have DNF'd, let me talk to you about one great book that's currently on Amazon. It's called Serve Cold, and it is an anthology of your favorite horror tubers and author tubers, and also me. And it is available, there's a link below. It's edited by Regina Sinclair of Regina's Haunted Library and Steve Donahue, and I'm looking forward to getting my copy and reading it. Believe me, you want to read it. I want to read it. So, I'll start on this topic with a disclaimer that, it should go without saying, but yeah, probably I should speak about it. I know that there are some great indie books out there, and I know there are a lot of mediocre traditionally published ones. I mean, I spent this year being hooked and reading Will White's Cradle series like a maniac, and it's an indie series. It's published through Amazon, and actually as I speak about these issues I have, the reasons why I DNF'd some books, I'll also talk about Unsold, book 1 of Will White's Cradle, as a counterexample, because you know what, the first time I read it, I kind of benched it. It was, of course, there were some external circumstances too. Alright, it's not like it was bad and I left it, but it took me 3 months to read it because it was on ebook. I read it on mobile phone at a time that it was not quite easy to read. But you know what, after reading book 1 and getting into book 2, I loved the series, and I think that even though there were some hiccups in Unsold, and it did kind of what I'm talking about, it actually managed to do it in a way that it was working. And most of the things I will say are things that an agent or an editor, a professional, would notice, and they would either point out that you should change this, this and this, or they'll just reject the book. And believe me, a lot of indie books are actually books that were pissed and rejected by the traditional publishing industry, and in that case it may have some of these problems. And I mostly DNF books during the first chapters, alright? If I'm halfway into the book, I'll soldier through. But sometimes the middle of the book may be not that great. The number one reason I will DNF the book, it is because there is a confusing setup. What I mean, I'll use examples for these things, alright? So I was reading a book, I started reading it quite some time ago, and I'm still trying to finish it. And a reason I'm struggling with this book is because I was initially confused about the setting and the main character. You see, it starts in a certain setting, and the character has a certain role within an organization there, and they have a life, they have some goals, and at some point in the book it flashes everything away. All the setup just goes away, which is not necessarily bad. The problem is that the premise and the synopsis of the book is about flash away everything you've done in the first part, because there is something on the other side. And believe me, there are a lot of excellent books that do that. That the hero starts in safety, or in a bad spot, and they have to go away. I mean, Unsold does that. But here there's a lot of detail, and I know that all this detail ultimately won't matter. To be honest, I have not finished the book. I know it's book one of a series, so a lot of the pedantic of the details of the first part may come into focus later. They may be important later. However, if you have to go through this, if you have to introduce a complicated setting that the character will go away from, keep it short or make it interesting. I mean, Unsold. Unsold is a great example because it sets up an entire community, an entire society, and halfway through the first book, we learn that the hero should leave this society and go away, and what he knew is not the exact truth. However, the initial setting and the way that the character is set up within it is very clear, and the synopsis never ever explicitly states that this society, this setup won't matter. I mean, up to the halfway point, I was certain that our hero would stay in this society for quite some time, and then shit hits the fan and he has to go away. But you know what? It was interesting. It was clear what I was reading, and yeah, it's important later on. So let's go to reason number 2, when the stakes get muddled. I mean, Start with a Bang exists as a rule because of this thing, because you need to have states. There should be a clear hook in the early pages, even the first page. A question, a mystery, a conflict, some foreshadowing. So me as a reader, I have to care about what is happening, and I would go on. This book I did finish, because it was an arc. It was a thriller, alright? It starts with the main character investigating something, a situation, and we're told about it. However, we're never shown why this matters until very late into the book. So I was like, why am I reading this? It was in media res too. So it starts with a character doing something. It starts with a bang, sort of, but it's never clear why this is happening, and the mystery and the conflict are never quite clearly set, which is something that it's very important to have a conflict. Not the main conflict though. It's not necessary to have the main conflict in the first pages. You can have some stupid conflict, alright? I mean, in Cradle, in Unsold, we get the introduction where Leon, the protagonist, is going through a ritual and he fails, so he ends up a pariah in his society, which does not respect the weak. In the very next chapter, we see him as a teenager. He's trying to survive in the society, he's trying to get a magic fruit of sorts, and we see clearly what the consequences of him failing the test are. And these consequences create some complication for him. And as we explore the complications and the challenges he has to face, we learn more about the setting. So at every point, there is always something that's working against the hero. It starts when we want to know why our character failed the test. And after that, we see how unfairly he's treated and how he is the underdog in the story. And since it's a story about gaining power, about the main character gaining power, we see that yes, we want to see how he takes his vengeance upon the people who wronged him. And even though this is a minor issue within the entire series, there is conflict there, and the scales in this series keep getting bigger and bigger. However, at every point there is a clear stake, a clear conflict. You want to see how it gets resolved, and by the time it gets resolved, something new has come up. Another conflict is on the horizon, so you're always hooked and you want to know what's happening next. Alright, reason number 3. Too much focus on details. Needless details. I started reading this book quite a couple of years ago. The main character is part of an organization. They get briefed on a mission. Then they go out, they find their partner, they travel together, they stop, they have breakfast, they chit-chat, and that's where I quit. Because there were a lot of unnecessary details bothering the beginning of the book. Okay, I know that they have a mission, but I never see what this mission is, and the way it's they have breakfast and they chill and talk, it doesn't feel urgent to me. I'm just, I don't trust the author. Something very important about indie books is that the author hasn't been vetted. They didn't have to go through agents and editors and the crazy requirements of the traditional publishing industry. They just went on KDP and pressed published. So I have zero faith in an indie published author, and I know this sounds harsh, but I don't know you and I don't trust you. You have to try extra hard to make me like your book, because if the first 10 pages are not to my liking, I'm not giving you a chance. That's the reality of reading and publishing, alright? So yeah, the main idea is that you have to cut out the unnecessary details, at least in the beginning, give a tangible hook, and then start adding details to immerse me as the reader to the world. And yeah, the details should be pertinent and important, not chit-chatting and having breakfast on a motel or something. I mean, in Unsold, we read about the ritual. Again, as I said before, we see the consequences of what's happening, and we start to learn more about the world as Lyndon is navigating those consequences. It's the same as above, only instead of, of not showing enough stuff, here we show too much. It's the inverse of it. And God forbid somebody may have done both of them at the same time. But the main thing is, in muddled stakes, we lack information about why we should care. Should we care? If we have too much focus on details, we're bogged down by things we don't care about yet. Let's get to step 4. When you introduce distracting elements, and it's pretty similar to 3, but I'll give you an example of this one. It's not the book I've read. Let's assume that I've read a book about a community of Polish Jews, alright? It's set in the 50s, but it narrates the heroic deeds of one of its members. It's a man who is hailed as a great hero, a savior, because back in 1937 he saved a lot of lives during a flash flood. And I know some of you watching this video, you're already screaming, what about the Holocaust? Which is my point, because yeah, we introduced this great story of a hero who saved a lot of lives during a flood, and that's heroic and admirable and very interesting, but between this event I've mentioned about and the time that the story is narrated, we have a huge tragedy. And when you narrate this story, this tragedy is going to come up again and again and again. So at this point, I'm reminded that, hey, there is something much more important in the story. Why am I reading about the flash flood and not about the person who hid people from, the Nazis? That's a more interesting story to read. Why am I bothering with this old man who saved people? I mean, yes, it was important, the flood was important, the Holocaust was much more important. And Unsold has something like that, has the Abidan subplot, which, just for you who have not read this book, there is some sort of angelic beings that are fighting a war in heaven, and we see part of the story, not part of the story, we see a separate story through the eyes of one of them. And I always found this part confusing, because it has nothing to do with the main story. This chapter made me feel like I was missing something. Like this series was a continuation of another series that I have not read and I had to go back and read it. And then this subplot comes in, crashing into the main plot, and that's the inciting incident for the entire series. So yeah, I can see why it's there, and now I know, and I'm clearly interested in seeing where it goes. And this continues throughout the books, alright? But I just assume that yes, it will come up later, and it does. But still, it's a driving force and a reminder of where the series is probably going, I guess. So yeah, that's how it escapes the situation, how Unsold tackles this very important event. And at any point, yes, it's a war in heaven and entire worlds are being destroyed. However, the focus is still on Lyndon and his quest to do what he does in the series. It's just endgame stuff, I guess. And actually it enriches the story, because at some point we start to understand how this ties to the main story and what's at stake. So yeah, well played, Will White, even though I was confused at the beginning. Finally, not splitting the books. Well, let's be honest, a lot of books nowadays are written as series, especially in fantasy, sci-fi, geek fiction, etc. And a 3-act structure exists for a reason. Sometimes though, an author might think that, alright, I finished part of the story, this arc of the story, but it's too short, I should probably add more into it. So basically what happens is that we get a climax midway through the book, and then we get into another arc starting in the same book, and this means that we were in this high, and then we start to get into a low again, because there's a setup and a new climax eventually. And I don't know about you girls, you probably enjoy this, alright? But as boys, when we get to the climax, we need some rest. We need to finish and maybe we can start next. So yeah, that happens to novels too. You can hit a high point, and if it just goes down and builds to something different, then it's a spot where it starts to get bogged down. The main reason to have the midpoint is that it's not a climax, it's peak tension. And if something is resolved in the midpoint, and then we start the second part of Act 2 with a totally new plotline or a new goal or something, it's not working. And Cradle never did this. Even in Unsold, where at the midpoint there seems to be some sort of a climax of resolution of a lot of conflicts, then something happens and it wipes the board clean, and you have to start fresh, and it gets much more complicated. So that's how it's done. Finally, it goes without saying that having decent prose, having decent editing is very important for people to read your books, because if it's full of typos, you can do all those things right, but still, it will be a tough sell and a tough read. Hope this video was interesting and helpful to you. If it was, hit the like button, subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching.